Friends, I'd like to welcome you to St. John's United Methodist Church and our Good Friday service. But tonight is not a normal service. It is not a service of worship, nor a service of remembrance. Instead, it is a service of witness. For tonight, we will be witness to one of the greatest travesties of justice of all time. An innocent man will be put to death for promoting love. I can think of no greater tragedy than that. Whether you believe that Jesus Christ was God, Emmanuel on earth, or simply a man who embodied the teachings of God perfectly, he was still a man without sin, a man without hate in his heart, a man who promoted equality and justice and freedom from oppression, and love and honor of the poor and the worst off among us. And for that, he was put to death by the authorities. The Romans, who feared more than anything else that their system of money and power would be disrupted, and the Jews of the temple, who felt their own power, their own prestige, their own place of privilege to be threatened. Tonight I will read from the Gospel of John, but I will also be reading from works of Christian fiction in an effort to dramatize, to bring home what we have known our entire lives, that we may see in a new light and in new words what befell our beloved Savior. A reading from the Gospel of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ according to St. John. Jesus went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley to a place where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, because Jesus often went there with his disciples. So Judas brought a detachment of soldiers together with police from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that was to happen to him, came forward and asked them, "Whom are you looking for?" The soldiers replied, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they stepped back and fell to the ground. Jesus asked the soldiers, "Whom are you looking for?" The soldiers replied, "Jesus of Nazareth." So Jesus answered them, "I told you that I am he. So if you are looking for me, let these men go." This was to fulfill the word that had been spoken, "I did not lose a single one of those who you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's slave, and cut off his right ear. Jesus told him, "Put your sword back in its sheath. Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me?" So the soldiers, their officer, and the Jewish police arrested Jesus and bound him. First they took him to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was better to have one person die for the people. Then the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Jesus said to him, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard what I said to them. They know what I said." When he had said this, one of the police standing nearby struck Jesus in the face. The policeman said, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered him, "If I have spoken wrongly, testify to the wrong. But if I have spoken rightly, why do you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest, and from there they took Jesus to Pilate's headquarters. It was early in the morning. They themselves did not enter the headquarters so as to avoid ritual defilement and to be able to eat the Passover. Pilate asked the Jews of the temple, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" The temple Jews replied, "If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." But Pilate told them, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." But the temple Jews replied, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death." A reading from the Nazarene by Shalom Angst. Pilate's secretary spoke. This criminal was its spiritual leader. He is much more dangerous than Bar-Abba, for Bar-Abba can be struck down with arms. But this man finds his way into the hearts of his followers, inflames their imaginations, dissuades them from obedience to the Caesar, and bids them prepare themselves for another life and another order in which he will be their Messiah. Messiah, said Pilate. I have heard that word before. What does it mean? I tried once more to explain. The Messiah, it's a fantasy of theirs that one day a liberator will appear, sent to them by their God. By means of his magic, he will conjure down hosts from heaven, and he will lead them to the conquest of all their enemies. They will destroy Rome, which they call Edom, and slaughter all of us, the Caesar, the generals, and the troops, after which this Messiah will rule over them and over all the world. And they believe that? They take it seriously? They do indeed. They wait every day for the appearance of their deliverer. Then all of them ought to be crucified together with him, roared Pilate. And he is supposed to be their Jewish king? Suddenly he burst into convulsive and uncontrollable laughter. Then he has had himself proclaimed as such. He had himself conducted into Jerusalem on a little donkey, while his followers proclaimed him the Messiah. Oh yes, isn't that the man we saw in a big procession when we were on our way to the theater? The same, I said. The next day he burst into the temple courts and drove out the dove merchants and the money changers, whipping them with a rope. We have good grounds for believing that the scholars and even the priests want to keep him out of our hands. It was only because of your strict orders that I was able to arrest him. They all expect him to perform great miracles according to his promise. When he will have liberated them from our rule, they will crown him the Jewish king. They are waiting outside the courts for the moment when he will annihilate us with the breath of his mouth. I looked at Pilate. His face had turned slightly green, partly with rage, partly with fear. I really believed that in the depths of his heart he had become uneasy in the presence of this mystic, incomprehensible person who stood there in his white robe, silent and motionless, steeped in earnestness, as though he could indeed at any moment lift up his arms and command hosts to descend from the skies. The soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they dressed him in a purple robe. They kept coming up to him and saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and striking him on the face. Pilate said to the Jewish conspirators, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no case against him." Then Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to the temple Jews, "Here is the man." And they yelled out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" But Pilate told them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no case against him." The conspirators replied to Pilate, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die because he has claimed to be the Son of God." Now when Pilate heard this, he was more afraid than ever. Pilate asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" Jesus remained silent. Pilate grew frustrated. He asked Jesus, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Do you not know that I have the power to release you and the power to crucify you?" Jesus said to him, "You would have no power over me unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." Sensing Pilate's indecision, the Jews of the temple reminded the Roman governor, "If you release this man, you are no friend of the emperor. Everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor." When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside and sat on the judge's bench at a place called the Stone Pavement, or in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover, and it was about noon. Pilate said to the temple Jews, "Here is your king." They shouted in reply, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" So Pilate asked them, "Shall I crucify your king?" And they replied, "We have no king, but the emperor." A reading from Jesus, biography by Paul Johnson. Thus occurred the greatest miscarriage of justice in history, the exemplary and archetypal portrayal of law, of legal procedure, of the rules of evidence and proof, and of all the orderly processes whereby a verdict is reached. Every vice and weakness which vitiates justice was present, from cowardice and perjury to mob rule. Both Jews and Romans, in their different traditions, revered the law. They were the two greatest lawmakers of all time. But here, they combined to enact a joint travesty, which has told through the centuries as the antithesis of law. It is hard to say who was more to blame for this huge evil, Caiaphas, the accuser, or Pilate, who had the power. A reading from the Nazarene. After a time, the gates of the procuratorium opened again, and a squad of Roman soldiers under an officer led forth the Nazarene. Now he wore again his white mantle, which in truth was no longer white, for in part it dragged, together with his ritual fringes, along the earth, and it left the red stain of his blood on the stones. The crown of thorns was still on his head. His face was hidden from us, for he bowed down almost to the ground by the cross which they had laid on his back, tying his arms around it backwards. And it seemed to us that the cross was heavy with more than its own weight, and that invisible burdens pressed his body down, so that it would break any moment. He strode forward, thus oppressed, and every step came slowly, with infinite pain, like the splitting of the Red Sea. Behind him walked Hermanus, the terror of the Jews, his face inflamed with fury and drenched in sweat. He flourished a whip in his hand, and the lash came down on the Nazarene. Foam of rage and bloodthirst whitened the corners of Hermanus' jaws. A tormented man, on whose body the drops of mortal anguish mingled with the drops of blood, drew forward, his limbs quivering under the load and the lash, his garments thick with damp, clinging to him. His footsteps left red imprints on stones. A reading from Jesus, a biography. Jesus was compelled, according to penal customs, to carry the heavy cross on which he was to be crucified to the place of execution, Golgotha. It is not a long distance. You can walk it today, through the narrow streets of old Jerusalem. But Jesus, weak from shock, from loss of blood, having had no sleep, and having been subjected to various cruelties, blows, and buffets, stumbled 3 times under his burden. So the soldiers escorting him compelled a passing stranger, Simon of Cyrene, to help him carry the cross. Luke says that a crowd gathered to watch, not the rehearsed temple mob, but ordinary citizens. A great company of people and of women, which also bewailed and lamented him. Jesus stopped in his Via Dolorosa and spoke to them. Daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming in which they shall say, Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bare, and the paps which never gave suck. Then shall they begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do these things in a green tree, what shall be done in the dry? It is remarkable that Jesus, in his weakness and pain, should have become again the poet, delivering this hymn of warning, which was to be so abundantly justified a generation later in the terrible siege of the city. Many of those weeping women, and more of their children, were to be slaughtered. A reading from the Nazarene. Golgotha, the place of skulls, was the hill not far from the city walls where they were wont to crucify those condemned by the government. The name had arisen from the ruling made by the government that all who suffered death upon this hill should remain hanging upon the cross until the birds had eaten their flesh, whereas it was the law of Israel that not even he who had been executed for his crimes should remain unburied for a single day. Time and again, the sages had pleaded with the Romans to abrogate this cruel decree, but their efforts were fruitless. Golgotha was a word of terror among the Jews, a word denoting abomination and foulness. There the Romans crucified him, and two others, one on either side, Jesus between them. Pilate also had an inscription written and put on the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this inscription because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek. The chief priest begged Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but this man said, 'I am the King of the Jews.'" But Pilate told him, "What I have written, I have written." A reading from the Nazarene. We stood at a distance and watched. With hearts tormented by fear, we waited. Silence came upon the world. Such silence that we could hear the wind moving among the crosses and among the dead bodies on the crosses. We did not dare to breathe, for now, we were certain something was about to happen. Now the rabbi had come down to the lowest abyss of pain. Now he had reached the narrow boundary dividing life from death. He stood before the last door. His eyes had seen everything. His ears had heard everything. His body had been penetrated by all sorrows, all agonies. It was filled to overflowing with the wine of bitterness. He had drained the cup of tears to the last drop. And we understood why he had let them bring him here, to the summit of Golgotha. It was in order that he might begin the ascent to the highest salvation out of the nethermost pit of human wickedness, from ultimate depth to ultimate glory. And the song trembled on our lips, with thee in the highest. When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier. They also took his tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from the top. The soldiers said, "Let us not tear it, but let's cast lots for it to see who will get it." And that is what the soldiers did. Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." And then to the disciple he said, "Here is your mother." And from that hour the disciple took her into his own home. A reading from the Nazarene. The women stood before the cross and beheld his anguish. And one of them, the tall Miriam, laid her head on the breast of the other Miriam, who supported her. But the tall Miriam fell nevertheless on her knees and stayed thus a while. Then suddenly she rose and stood without help, her face uncovered, and she looked straight into the face of the sufferer on the cross. There were no tears in her eyes. They were big and wide open and dry. Her face was like stone. Her lips were tight. There was no movement of any muscle on her face, which was turned towards the sufferer. And it seemed as though his pain and hers moved back and forth between them. We could see the pain of his flesh entering into her. Then suddenly it seemed as though the anguish which had sucked into herself had made her taller, and had given strength and stature to her body, and strength to her legs, so that they no longer tottered under her. There was no tear in her eyes. Not one moan came from her lips. She grew mighty with the pains which flowed into her through her eyes. And thus it was with her till the end. Then he who was on the cross began to twist again in anguish, and foam broke out on his lips. His face was drawn, and it fell once more to his breast. His lips began to murmur something. And the Roman commander that stood there took a sponge from a soldier and dipped it into a liquid. And he lifted the sponge on a staff and lifted it to the lips of the sufferer amid the laughter of the soldiers. Then he who was on the cross turned his eyes fully upon the Roman look was filled with pain, and yet it was strong and compassionate too. And we heard him say, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." When the Roman commander heard these words, he took a step nearer to the cross and spoke to the sufferer, but we did not hear their words. Then suddenly the rabbi on the cross lifted his eyes to heaven and moaned bitterly, and from his lips came the cry, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani." And when the women heard this cry from the tormented lips, she lifted up her hands to the cross and called, "Tinochi, Tinochi, my little one, my little one." But the despair and death terror on the rabbi's face lasted but a moment. He became strong again, and calmness returned to him. The spasm ceased in his body, as though sleep had come upon him. He became small, as if he had shrunk in on himself, and his legs bent slowly. With a last effort, he looked upon the heavens, and in a loud, clear voice called, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." And therewith he let his head fall again, and he closed his eyes. Then over his lips passed a forgiving smile. Peace descended on him. We heard him murmur as if in a song of sleep, "Into thy hands I deliver my soul." And he died in sanctity and purity, the smile upon his lips.